Welcome to Creating Better Products, where we explore the real world stories from product leaders, not just their successes, but also their failures and lessons learned. You will get practical tips that you can apply tomorrow. I'm your host, Sabrina Mach. I have almost 2 decades of experience and I love learning from others. This is why my mission is to share the stories of amazing product and design professionals with you and the world so that we can learn together from each other. Today, my guest is Ammara Gafoor. She's a business value expert on data products, data mesh, agile, and value based portfolio management. Wow. She's also the author of the ebook called Data Mesh in Practice. And Ammara currently leads the data and AI strategy for healthcare and life sciences for ThoughtWorks Europe. And a fun fact, in her free time, Ammara has discovered the joy of running. And she says she's always trying to catch up. Ammara, tell me more about this. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Sabrina.
Wonderful. So, beyond running and catching up, we will talk about how to bring product thinking to data in a traditional organization. So, product thinking and the data space is already unusual. And then doing that in a traditional organization is often even more unusual. How did you first get into this topic?
How did I get into the topic? Not by choice. Well, honestly, I've always liked working in the product space. I enjoy working on innovative products, and it so has happened that in the last 5, 6 years, data has been at the forefront. Everybody's talking about data. Data projects are very interesting, and I happen to be on a project that started out to be just a product but turned out to be more about data, and that's how I was just got into the world of data and product thinking in data.
And you have done quite a number of different projects and engagements. And I think to make it really tangible, I'd love to hear about one of those engagements where you've helped clients with data and really hear about your journey. How was that for you? Where did it start? What was the context? And what were kind of the lessons learned? So, all my questions all at once at you.
Okay, this is going to be a lecture for 45 minutes, everyone. Buckle in. I'm joking. Yeah, like I mentioned, this one of the projects that I always feel was the highlight of what really made me love it as well was I worked for a pharmaceutical company, and they invited us to build a product for them, and it was supposed to be a very traditional one source for all solution. That means they have data in multiple different locations, and they wanted us to pull this data from multiple locations in a very traditional sense. It's almost the most typical data projects. I have data in many sources. Can you please pull this data from all these different sources? Can you put it in one place? In the data world, we call this the data lakes. So can you please put it in a data lake so that people in my team can have easy access to it? And it was considered to be just like a repository. Please, can I have easy access to my data? And very interestingly, we were looking in this project for this was for scientists and for researchers. And to give you an example, a scientist usually they work on what are called as studies. So remember your COVID times, and we were all waiting for, oh my God, when is the study going to be complete? When is it going to go into clinical trials? And all of us were hearing about these terms. So yeah, that's the bread and butter of scientists who are working in pharmaceutical industry. And I remember distinctly, yeah, these scientists basically wanted to have information or knowledge about these studies. So they asked us to build a project for them where you would give in a study ID and you would get all the knowledge that is associated with the study. So all the information about the study. And I remember thinking, okay, yeah, cool. We'll have to find out what information is important, what is needs to be prioritized. So, your traditional value-based thinking, who needs what data for what job to be done, etc. Right? But the turning point, and I think this was the coolest part, is very early on we realized, or when we looked into how would they use the system, we realized that we were building a system for people to enter a study ID and retrieve information for it. But in reality, people would really not know what study to look for because they had their own study and they knew all the information about their own study. What they were looking for was similar studies, or studies where something similar had been observed. And this was a completely different project now. It sounds the same, but searching for a study by a study ID is like opening your dictionary and looking for a word. And now what we are trying to do is to find similar words with meaning. So you imagine looking for meanings, but not, you don't really know what the word is. So it's almost like reverse searching it. And now this was completely different. And it really changed the entire scope of the project. And we had to take a step back and think about, all right, when would we search for it? How would we search for it? How do we search for it right now? And it turns out in the data world, it's quite traditional. The way they search for it right now is they ask people. They call up somebody and say, have you seen this finding before? And the most senior person in the department basically says, yeah, check maybe studies that were conducted between 2000 and 2002 in this department. And this is how people basically then go look. And this is a very tiresome process. And so the idea of applying product thinking, of who is it for, who will use it, how will they use it, how do they apply it to their day-to-day job, this concept itself was very alien in the data world. And so this was where it was started being interesting. It started being tangible. The scope of projects changed completely. So yeah, that was, I would say, my introduction into this world, and also really where I started being very passionate about it.
Yeah, interesting. So that was, yeah, your aha moment,
Mhm, absolutely.
driving and realizing something's missing. We need to look at this in a different way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you mentioned that this concept was alien within that organization. So once you had your aha moment, how did you then convince the organization to adopt that new way of thinking? How did you go about bringing product thinking into this very traditional space
Mhm.
where people started with, well, here's what we need to do, this is the defined solution, to then realizing actually we need to step back and really understand the need of scientists?
So I think I've been lucky in the sense that I worked with some really intelligent clients, and it helped that they were scientists. And because they were scientists, they were very, very used to the idea of experimentation, the idea of hypothesis driven development, something that we often apply in the product world. Let's make a hypothesis and let's see whether the data supports it or not. It's very traditionally in the scientific world. So the scientists themselves, or the business people, or people with the traditional business knowledge, were actually quite on board. It was the IT knowledge, because such companies are not often tech at core. And this is also not expected. They're not expected to be technology forward, right? It's associative function. And so traditionally for an associative function, you don't need to be that data driven. When we say associative function, we mean in the traditional sense, it was requirements were written by business, this is what we need. In a very waterfall model, it's given to the IT organization. But once we saw the world has evolved, and once we kind of proposed this to the business experts, to the scientists, to them they were completely on board. But we had to prove it to them. We couldn't just say this is important or this is necessary. We had to prove it to them with the data, because we were talking to scientists. So we had to up our game. There was no, oh, let's just be agile. We really had to be data driven and agile. And so we did that. We used a concept called as prototyping, which is, we didn't even build a product. It's like we didn't even build a POC. We didn't even build a prototype. We pretended we had a product, and that's one of the ways of what we call as prototyping. And when somebody would send us an email saying that, yeah, I'm looking for a study which is similar to with these findings, we would manually go search it and go send it back out as an email. And what we were trying to do was collect the data for demand, because we were trying to see, is there demand for this or not, before even we started building this product. And it was so cool because we never added functionality, or we never really built the functionality before we actually had the demand for it. So we would put a button, or somebody would give us a requirement saying that, oh, we absolutely need to have a functionality like searching by chemical compound structure. And we would add the button, but we wouldn't build the functionality, like by code implemented, until there was enough demand for it. Like actually enough people had clicked on it, and we had gotten through that initial interest phase of what the button is for. And only once we had that regular demand for it, we saw, all right, people actually need this functionality, that's when we implemented it. And before that, we manually did it and sent back the results via email. So We still wanted to delight our customers, but often traditional organizations have limited resources. And we learned to work within the boundaries that were available to us, but at the same time, being data driven, not just saying we are data driven. But what was surprising to me was that the concept of these cross functional teams that are so normal to us is not so normal in traditional data organizations. It's very often there is one team for one source system database. Then there's another team for another source system database. Then there's another team for one integrated database. Then there's one team for just pulling that data and giving it to somebody. Then there is another team for who takes care of the dashboards. And then finally there's a user. So think about the sheer number of layers and handoffs and knowledge transfers that has to happen and how long the process takes. And so a problem that is has often been already solved in the software industry or in the software engineering industry, I would say, was something that hadn't been yet applied to the data industry. But again, there are its own sets of challenges. I'm not saying you can just directly impose on it, but it surprises me how often us product people think we don't fit into the data world just because we are not data developers. And I think that was surprising to me.
So we have all those layers of functional teams where now you're coming in and say, let's cut across and have a cross-functional team solve this challenge. I can imagine that that might be quite challenging
It
because
is.
established ways of working are different. How do you
Absolutely.
do it?
I think it's quite similar to anybody who's been part of a digital transformation project. It's slow. It consists of a lot of change management and it consists of a lot of communication. It's about a lot of executive buy-in. It requires effort, time, energy, money, and convincing skills, I would say. So in our case, it's often about starting small, but also it's the beauty of showing progress. It's the beauty of showing results and then getting buy-in holistically from people who see that it works, and then a little bit of pressure where it doesn't work as well.
Yeah. So you say it takes time and it's a transformation. Does that mean it takes a long time until we see that first value? How do you do that
I would
quick?
say it it really always depends on the first person. For a team that has bought into the idea, like for my first project, my data project, we went into a team that had a person who was bought into the idea of trying this out. And we had freedom within the scope of this team, within the scope of this department. And there we showed value. So there we were, time to value was quite fast. In fact, they were so amazed because our time to value was like 7 weeks. And we had our first MVP out in 7 weeks, and it was incredible. It was genuinely one of those projects that you will always remember. And there it was then a little bit more holistic. Other teams saw, other departments saw what was possible, and then they wanted to adopt it. And that's how you kind of spread and grew. I've been part of a much larger transformation at a different company, which I was there for about 3 years. And there it was the brainchild of the head of the data of organization of that company to actually force this almost on different teams and departments to make them introduce product thinking into the data world. And in that case, it was no longer an isolated transformation. It was a complete data transformation, right? And in that case, you need that executive sponsor. You need somebody who's standing there and insisting, no, this is how it's going to be done. So you do need one person or a group of people who are willing to take a chance there. But people take a chance when they have seen success. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg story. So don't feel scared to start, in my opinion. Show that success and use that success to convince an exit.
Yeah. And showing that success can be done with something
Absolutely.
like a prototype, like you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Do you have any other ways of how you showed success quickly? Any other methods beyond the prototype?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that boils down to our principles of product thinking. It could be from being very targeted about the personas you go for, or it could be very targeted about which part of the user journey that you target. One example that we recently used was we used product thinking in identifying what we called as the decision points in a user journey, where in the user journey are decisions being taken, and then we just try to prioritize these decision points and see which decision points has the highest impact and what kind of impact that is. And we were very strategic about it because we chose a decision point that we knew the executive leadership of this company, it would matter to them. And so we made the data around this decision point. We applied product thinking for the data around this decision point. And the first project is almost takes the same time as even without product thinking. But the second project suddenly was so much faster because now we had reusable data products from the first project as well. And the execs were extremely surprised beyond measure because they had never seen a project happen that fast and at a decision point that mattered to them. So now we had caught their attention and we knew how to catch their attention. And so we were very targeted about it as well. So if the idea is just to apply thinking to data, then go ahead and apply product thinking to data in whatever scope of project you have. But if it's about a larger transformation or if it's about bringing change to your organization, then being smart and strategic about it is also the way to go. Don't just do any project, do a project that somebody cares about.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Linking it back to business value and goals that people in that organization have already today. You're helping them advance, and by doing that, they'll help you advance on your goals as well.
Yeah, and sometimes it's so hard to make this link between the business goals and between the work you're doing. And I think people try it, but it just feels so hypothetical almost. And it's almost just theoretical. That doesn't feel like it's implementable. And that's not really the fault of teams either, because sometimes these goals seem to cover everything in the world. We want to be a data driven organization, we want to be the fastest in the market. And that's your business goal. How do you tangibly tie your data goals to that? It just feels too vague. And in such cases where the business goals haven't really been broken down into something that you can anchor into, I would say look for your decision points. Go find out what points are decisions being made and what kind of decisions are being made. So there's almost always like either it's a money decision, efficiency decision, operational efficiency. Like you have those types of decisions and look for those in those decision points.
And once you have that decision point, what can people do? So I've identified a cost saving decision point. How do I then link my initiative to that?
If you're working on a data project, it's quite straightforward actually in this case, because the decision point, if it's reduction in cost, then the first why is, well, how is the cost being reduced? Like what are the factors that depend on it being reduced? And then the next question is, what data do I need to see in order to know whether we're in the right direction or not? The first one is the cost being reduced or not. The second point, what impacts it? Like what influences the cost to be reduced? So you're almost working backwards and seeing what data. You always are working backwards to see what data do I need in order to have observability on this decision point. And so you keep working backwards till you have a use case of who's looking at it, why they're looking at it, how does it change. Mhm.
I wonder your recommendations, would they look differently for an organization that is an automotive company or bank that might work and think very differently?
So I think the big difference is actually whether it's a regulated industry or an unregulated industry. And I think in unregulated industries, I worked for an e-commerce company for a while, and that's an unregulated industry. The only aspect of such companies, unregulated industries, is that they generally a little faster and don't fall under this traditional bucket that I'm talking about. When we're speaking about the traditional bucket, often I put it under banking and healthcare. Banking, healthcare, pharma are the very, very traditional, regulated, slow organizations, often for a good reason as well, because changes you make have tangible impacts on people, on real life and real people. So you have to be a little slower about these things. So when you're talking about, all right, I want to now have suddenly a cross-functional team, this won't probably happen. Your organizational structure might remain the same. Your reporting lines might make the same, but you might just have a shadow team that exists for a bit. So you don't really make those official changes, but you might have unofficial shadow teams that pop up. And that's also fine. So it's a slower process till you prove it's possible, and then you go through those regulated steps. So to answer your question, would this work in an industry like an automotive? Absolutely, especially in the unregulated parts of the automotive industry as well. There's no reason why it would not apply there.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned the shadow team, which sounds really fascinating. How can I imagine that? Is that an informal way of working together, making sure you get different perspectives on your product development? How does a shadow team
Yeah,
work
that's
together?
really Cool. In the first shadow team that I worked, it was genuinely very, very informal. Like even the line managers were not informed that all these people were working together. People just found out, oh yeah, there's this project and it's interesting. And we just started involving people in making group decisions. We wouldn't just involve them with requirements, we would involve them with what is it that we're trying to achieve, or what's the hypothesis we're trying to check. And suddenly this was a different way of working and it was interesting to people. And usually in the beginning it's like, oh no, this is not my work, but then it's like, oh no, but this is what we're trying to achieve. And it was a change from, can you please give me this data from this database from this column, to this is a persona, this is their job, can you work with me for an hour to think about what data they might need. And so suddenly people were doing something that was slightly out of the ordinary, and the interested people who were responding positively to this suddenly joined this shadow group organization, like shadow team almost, and that was the first phase, I would say, back in 2019, 2020. Since then, product thinking has come a long way. And product thinking in data has come a long way. So it's become a lot more mainstream, I would say. So almost in every traditional organization, you also have people in the data world who have informed themselves and are educated now in terms of how much benefit product thinking brings, and they probably have heard about this, or they've probably attended a conference or read an article about it, right? And so there would be somebody who's like a trailblazer in the organization who's setting up one product team somewhere or two product teams, and so those are now these official teams that may still have their reporting lines, they might still sit in the organization the way it is structured, but they have now been given some capacity to work on this, no longer shadow team, but this cross functional team, let me put it this way. So they're not 100% assigned, but there might be 60% assigned or 80% assigned. So this is another way of structuring teams. And in the most advanced organizations that I've been part of, even though they're in traditional orgs, every business unit had a dedicated product team already, so I've seen it across the spectrum. And even in traditional organizations, the spectrum exists. So you could have everything from shadow completely to temporary teams to complete permanent cross functional teams as well.
And sometimes it might feel like if we're not at the top end of the spectrum, that's bad. What would you say to that for organizations who are maybe at the start or in the middle of their journey might be thinking, wow, we need to do more?
Actually, it's a tough question. On one hand, I have seen teams trying to pull other teams along. Like, let me put it this way, an organization can have one team that's the trailblazer and then have all other teams that are basically at level zero or level one. And then there are organizations where they have 10 teams that are all mediocre, all in the middle place. So, what's better? The company that has a few success stories and everything else is failing, or the company that has a lot of average stories? And I think, as in all cases, the answer depends. It depends. In the first case, those success stories were necessary to get further funding so that they could invest more into more product teams. In the second case, they already had that buy in, but they needed all teams to move to some extent. So it was a much bigger undertaking. I think we shouldn't focus on these intangibles of where am I on this hypothetical spectrum. Rather, focus on what is it that I'm doing in terms of the product, what value is it bringing to the users. Stay focused on the problem statement, and there's always going to be somebody better, and that's just like life. That's not just data.
I really like that recommendation because we sometimes do get hung up by those hypothetical questions and where we on a maturity rating. And there's a lot of discussions around that. But saying, hey, it doesn't matter in some way. It's all about what value are we creating. And if we create great value, we are, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. And on the contrary side, I've also seen execs or people who are driving this product thinking in organizations, people who are actually responsible for bringing it in, being obsessed with these maturity assessments or maturity checklists. And they always go one team to the next team, trying to rank them, rate them. And I think the intention is good because they want to see what support they need to provide or what resources they need to save or what funding is needed. But we spend so much time on these assessments. I've seen years being spent on it without making any progress. Like I've literally seen these assessments happening for 1.5, 2 years on the same teams, on the same departments. And it's the very opposite of this psychological safety that a product cross-functional team is supposed to have, because you feel evaluated all the time. And I think that takes you as far away from product thinking as you can think.
Yes. And it sounds like in that situation, rather than being an enabler and a
Yeah.
means to an end, those assessments have become the end.
Yeah, oh, well phrased, well phrased.
And maturity assessments can be really valuable to see, hey, where are we when a team wants to take the next step? But it should be to enable and to empower the team rather than for management to drive to an arbitrary goal when it's all around creating value for the customers and users of the data products.
Yeah, I agree.
So, what was a positive highlight moment where you were like, oh, that's something that I didn't expect? But on the same side, I always like to flip it. What was a low light? Something where negative, where you thought, oh, that was a good idea, but it just didn't work.
Oh, ooh, what's an idea that just didn't work? I'm gonna start with the negative first, so that we can just end it on a positive note. um, Something that didn't work was the assumption that everybody would want to apply product thinking to their data. Just because it worked for one team, that would work for all teams. Just because it worked in one part of the company, that it would work for other parts of the company as well. It's not very different from non-data worlds, and I don't know whether this is sacrilegious to say this right now, but is product thinking needed everywhere? Do all projects need product thinking as well? Sometimes the requirements are very clear. To give you an example, you have a source system with data. It's going to be decommissioned. It's very expensive. We have to migrate it out. You don't have to overcomplicate it. You have to get the data. You have to get it from there. You have to get it into another system. So it does not apply to all contexts and situations. And trying to think that it applies everywhere is just valuable time that could be used somewhere else. Also, people who have worked with these systems, I think it's an easy mistake to underestimate their expertise with these systems and the expertise on how databases often behave and how data behaves and how expensive it can be. The sheer difference of making data available, like fresh data available every minute, every second, and once in 24 hours. It's a huge cost between this constant pull and having fresh data. Like, for example, when you open your weather app, you want to make sure you know exactly what the weather is today. But there are certain things you don't need to know immediately right now. It doesn't make a difference whether you check it right now or whether it's information that was last updated an hour ago. So we call this on demand updates and instant updates. So these things, people who are experts in their area often know. So don't underestimate the expertise of the people who have worked with these systems for a long time as well. I like the idea of it does not have to be everything or nothing approach. It always can be some principles of product thinking that are applied, need not be all principles, and that doesn't make it a success or failure. It just makes it an iterative process. So I think there I would put myself away from my high horse of, oh yeah, this is the only way, to also there are midway paths to achieving the same outcome that's necessary. That's something that I think I would look at again, if that makes sense. Was that tangible?
Yes, and I really like the nuanced view that yes, product thinking brings a lot of value and we need to apply it to the data space, but in the right context. It's not the unicorn solution for everything.
Absolutely, it's not. Yeah. Your other question was what went really well, or what was it? I forgot now.
Yeah, a positive surprise where you were like, wow, that was amazing.
It's just all been a brilliantly positive surprise. It's just the whole journey has been so positive. I mean, I'm going to use an example here. My colleague recently has written a book. Tiankai has written a book called as Humanizing Data Strategy, and it speaks about the human aspects of the people you deal with, right? And we speak about data strategy. We speak about how do you implement, for example, imagine if you want to implement product thinking for your data, it becomes a part of your data strategy. And there's the human aspect of it. Who are the people? How will you apply it? Who do you need to convince? How will you convince it? What are the fears? What are the hopes? And this is something that he is captured so well in his books. But I think that has also been always my biggest surprise or my experience. Like, people relate to stories, people relate to struggles, people relate to emotions, and I've often felt that the surprise has always been if I can make a connection with somebody, and I can understand why they're making a certain decision, or why they're pushing back against a certain thing, or why they want to promote something as well. This human aspect of making that connection helps you understand the process, the problem, the product itself so much better. So in the first project that we were building, remember about the studies? Once the scientists believed we were there to help them and not to replace them, we were in a completely different problem solving space. We were co-creating the solution rather than the IT people creating solutions that could potentially either be a bigger headache to them, or could potentially, in today's world where you think, oh, I'm getting replaced. And I think this is for me always still a positive, or the best part of my job, I would say, forming those human connections.
Yes, really interesting. The journey of co creation, it helps to make the solution better, but it also sounds like, by what you're saying, it helps to build trust and it helps to create joint ownership of driving this together. And that's a different dynamic than, hey, we're building this thing here and then you hear about it later. Really being part of that journey and, in a way, empowering people to shape that journey with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, sometimes product thinking boils down to that. It really boils down to co-creation, a common understanding, making sure, common understanding between the user, the business users, the technologists. It's somehow the intersection of product, business, and users, and that's product thinking.
Yes, and I think that's what's so fascinating when those three lenses come together. There's things that happen that we didn't expect just by our own
Yeah.
knowledge in our head. So maybe just to come to a closing, we talked about lots of interesting aspects of applying product thinking to the data space. Now, if we have listeners who are saying, this sounds great, I totally see that that's something that's lacking for some of the products that we're data products that we're building. How do I start? How do I continue? And maybe what's a pro tip for someone who's been doing this for years? And when you're like, oh, you know what? If you do that, it's even better.
Mm. If there's a pro user out there, maybe reach out to me and give me tips. I would love to hear from you. But for somebody who's just starting out, shameless plug out here, I have written a guide on it. It's called How to Apply Product Thinking to Data, and it's like a step-to-step guide on how actually to apply it, how to do it, how you go through the thought process. But if you don't really want to look at that, then I would say really just Google product thinking for data. Like, there's so much content out around data products and how do you think about data products. Yeah, Google designing data products, maybe that's the keyword you should go with. For experts out there, my 2 cents would be think away. Right now there are lots of tools in the market which are about each individual segment of the process itself, and you can actually buy these different tools, and a lot of companies are buying these tools to make it easier. So maybe taking a minute to step back and think, how are these tools actually bringing the journey together? Because the whole point of forming cross-functional teams was that we would be able to look at the journey end to end and treat it like a product. And what these tools are doing are reintroducing segment or fragmented approach for each step of the process. So you're spending more times integrating these tools when you're thinking about your data rather than thinking about what's the end-to-end journey. And so how are you going to make sure that you don't fall into that hole, really,
Super. And my final question, Amara, why do we need to apply product thinking to the data space to create better products?
Why?
Yeah, why?
Oh, yeah, because your AI is only as good as your data. You might call it the AI hype, or you might not, but it is changing the way we are doing work. And if you want it to be applicable to your organization, and if you want to make it contextual to your organization in whatever form that you want to use it, it's only as good as your data is under it. And the companies that will make a difference or will be able to adapt it or are adapting it better today are the ones that have structured their data better. And data products, or applying product thinking for your data, allow your data to be easily reused, easily applied to different AI models, easily be used with different AI agents. And that will make the difference between you and your competition. And I think this is what will make a step forward or leap forward for you as an organization.
Yeah, interesting. When you said, the quality you put in is the quality you get out, usually, or even I sometimes think people refer to data quality, but what I hear is that it's really around how well you are shaping your data products is the goodness that you put in and the goodness that you get out.
Also, but like even when we say data quality, right, Sabrina, your data quality is only as good as you've thought about your data. So when you've applied product thinking, you've thought holistically about your data. So your quality was probably going to be higher because you've considered all aspects of your data as well, right? And so you've thought about it. When we say data quality, we often think some of the columns are empty or it's not filled or it's filled wrong. This is what we mean by data quality. Why is this data quality issue also often there? Maybe because it was entered wrong, but also maybe because we didn't think about it properly, and so data product thinking automatically, if not elevating your quality, if it doesn't elevate your quality, it at least shows you, it makes you aware of your data quality. Or so oftentimes we're not even aware of how bad our data quality is, and product thinking makes this visible. It makes it observable to us, so we see at what position we are in. So if your quality itself is bad, and if your data itself is bad, and all components of your data were not considered, then how can your AI model be right? Because you didn't put in all everything that was necessary. You didn't think about it holistically.
Super. Thank you, Amara. And when you apply product thinking to the data space, what are the principles that made you successful?
Yeah, I would say being data driven, like really having metrics, really having the data to support your argument, that it makes a difference. Being very clear about your communication of what you're trying to do. Often we try to change something, we try to apply new ideas, but we don't tell anybody what we are trying to do or why we are trying to do this. And being very articulate about the why of what you're doing is, I think, a principle that I truly stand by. The third one, I think, continues from this, is building trust with the people, with the users, with your management, with your teammates, with your cross-functional teammates, about what is the common goal that you're trying to achieve. So this change, for example, with the end users, where we were co-creating these solutions, right? That comes in with this trust, and speaking about what is it that you're trying to do together, right? So having this trustful relation, being mindful of this trust. And finally, I think is also the change in the language itself. So instead of asking somebody, hey, can you please give me this data from this database, saying that I'm trying to solve a problem for this user. This is how I envision the solution. You're the expert in this database. What do you recommend is the right data to actually that is necessary for it, right? Or conversely, speaking to a business intelligence expert and saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing this for this user. They generally needed to apply it for their job in type ABC. This is the report I'm trying to make. What are the general reports that are useful for such questions? How are they generally interpreted? What's the easiest way that the execs look at graphs? What are the outliers here? So, really phrasing or making sure that you're getting the expertise of the people on ground who have worked in this area as well before and understand the nuances that maybe you, who's new, may not yet understand. So, the language you use would be my recommendation as well.
Super, really, really fascinating. What are three things that you would recommend people should look at that inspire you?
So I'm going to recommend a book which has got nothing to do with data and has got nothing to do with product thinking, but it's called Lauf, wie galt Lauf. It's about a person in Germany who ran 52 marathons a year. That means he ran a marathon every week. And this book speaks to me on such a personal level because it's about all the things all the walls you could possibly hit and how you can get over them, And in this book, it's a very physical sense of, okay, hitting walls, like physical walls, but anybody who runs can tell you it's also about the mental blocks that you hit, right? So when you are bringing product thinking into an organization, you're going to hit physical and mental walls, and you're going to need the emotional strength and stability to get through it and to truly believe that I'm doing the right thing. And if you believe you're doing the right thing, and if you're going to get through it, you need patience, you need empathy, you need you need a little push, you need a little pull, you need a little strength. And this book talks to you about how to build that strength up. Somebody who's bringing a new way of working always needs to be a little strong. And I think this is one way of thinking how I can be strong. So, yeah, that's my recommendation. Very tangibly in the data world, I would recommend my own book called Data Mission Practice Getting Off to the Right Start. It's an ebook, it's available to download. And then I do want to re recommend Chiang Kai's book about humanizing data strategy, which also speaks a lot about product thinking principles when you think about data and data strategy.
Where can people find you?
Ah, people can find me running in a park in Cologne, probably. Or if you're not following me around in Cologne, you will find me on LinkedIn. You can search for me by Ammara Gafoor. You will find me on it. I'm not on any other social media, but if you write to me on LinkedIn, I will most likely reply at some point.
Super. Thank you so much, Ammara. Thank you for joining us today. It was truly inspiring. It was truly inspiring. Thank
Thank you for having me, Sabrina.
you. Wonderful.
Yay.
Now, a question to our listeners. What is your experience with bringing product thinking to the data space? What were your successes? What were your setbacks? What were your lessons learned along the way? Please share your experience in the comments or reach out to me directly. I would love to hear from you and maybe have you as a guest in this show soon. And finally, if you liked the episode as much as I did, please share it with your network. Give us a like and subscribe in your favorite streaming platform. And by doing that, you help to elevate the voices of our amazing guests and the wonderful Ammara. So thank you and see you next time.